Okay, so inverses by graphing in tables, okay? Graphing is going to be continued in the other videos I uploaded. Right now we're just going to do an intro to inverses and talk about tables, okay? So an inverse in math, inverse means opposite, okay? So like adding and subtracting are opposites. So they're inverse operations of each other, right? That's why if you had 10 plus 2 minus 2, these two would cancel each other out. They undo each other because they're opposites, right? So 10 adding 2 and subtracting 2 just cancels out, leaving us with 10, right? Because 10 plus 2 is 12, and 12 minus 2 would bring us back to 10, okay? Those are examples of inverse operations, just like multiplication and division are also inverse operations, okay? So they reverse each other, they undo each other, they cancel each other out, right? So inverse functions are functions that are opposites or functions that reverse each other. So we're going to look at that in a second. These are just some examples of inverse functions, just so you kind of have an idea maybe what they look like a little bit, but we'll look at finding those next class or in a couple days. We'll look at that. So some function f of x equals 2x. That is the opposite of a function g of x equals x divided by 2. Once again, we'll look at more of that, how to find it next time. Another example would be x plus 3 and x minus 3. Those are opposite functions. So the way we show a function is an inverse function of another function is using this notation. So you already know f of x equals y, okay? You already know that. Well, f of x, or f to the negative 1 of x, right? This is the inverse function. Okay, so the inverse function of f. It is the y value, or it equals y for the inverse function. Okay, so the difference here is this negative 1. This one doesn't have 1, this one does. So the inverse function gets that negative 1. So up here we could say if f of x equals 2x, then its inverse function would be equal to x divided by 2. This is to show that this is the inverse function of f. Okay? Just like here, if f of x equals x plus 3, then we could say the inverse function of f equals x minus 3. Okay? We're going to look at a couple examples real quick. So example 1, the table given below shows the domain and range for a function of f of x. Fill in the domain and range for the inverse function, f to negative 1 power of x. Okay? So here's our f of x function. Here's our table. Okay? With functions, they are opposites. Okay? So all you're going to do is you are going to switch x and y. They're going to switch. Remember, f of x is the same thing as y. F to the negative 1 of x, it's also the same thing as y, just for your inverse function. So to find your inverse, or the opposite function of this function, all that happens is your x and y's swap places. Okay, you're just going to switch them. So if this point is negative 2, negative 5, I'm going to switch that x and that y. So my x is now what my y was, and my y is now what my x was. So all you do is flip your x and your y. You switch places. So 0, 1 becomes 1, 0. 1, 4 becomes 4, 1. And 3, 10 becomes 10, 3. That is it. Okay, they're opposite functions. So all you have to do is switch them. So basically, if you notice, x is our domain, right? Y is our range, So then our domain and our range switched. My domain was negative 2, 0, 1, 3. Now my range for my inverse function is the negative 2, 0, 1, 3. And then over here, our range was negative 5, 1, 4, 1, 4, 10. Now it became my domain, negative 5, 1, 4, 10. So your x and y switch, your domain and range switches. Okay, same thing as above, but this time I just want to list out the domain and range. Okay, so here is my x and my f of x, which is our y. So you know this is your domain and this is your range. Okay, domain is your x values, range is the y values. Now I want to list out the domain and range, but for my inverse function. So for my f, to negative 1 of x, our inverse function of x. Okay. So our domain and our range. Remember, to get the inverse, you switch the x and the y's, right? So if this was my domain, those numbers are now going for my range. So my range would be negative 4, negative 2, 6, and 20. And then now my domain is what my range was. So my domain is now 3, 4, 8, and 15. Pretty easy, right?